PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. The final round of the US Championship was very tense. Fabiano Caruana led the field by just a half point. So he knew that losing could be a disaster. A draw wouldn't guarantee him clear first. So he looked to play for a win. He had white against Sam Shankland. Well, Sam can have his ups and downs, but he's a former US champion and always very well prepared. Interesting that with black, he just went for a Sicilian and goes for one of the sharpest Sicilians, the Najdorf. So perhaps he had in mind he didn't want to play e4, e5. Caruana always very well prepared himself. He just wanted to mix things with a Najdorf, but it's a brave choice. So let's see, what did Fabiano have in mind here? Bishop g5, well, that is really one of the sharpest responses to the Najdorf. Shankland played e6, the normal move, the most popular move. And then queen f3 from Caruana. Very interesting. A bit of a sideline. I mean, the normal move here, of course, is to play f4 and then usually queen f3. But queen f3, yeah, a little bit unusual. So h6, that's the normal response from black. If white exchanges, then black is very happy to go into an endgame where black has two bishops. And the normal move here is bishop h4, the most popular move. But Caruana plays bishop d2. Right, this is quite a modern way of playing. So what you're doing is you're hoping at some point to be able to exploit the fact that that pawn is on h6 and perhaps later on play with g4 and h4 and use that h-pawn as a hook in order to open lines. Queen b6 played, hitting the knight. So the point of that is not just hitting the knight, but hitting the b-pawn as well. So that forces the knight back to a less active square. Now the queen isn't very good on b6, so it just nudges back to c7. Looking at the clock times, although Shankland wasn't spending ages, it's quite clear that he was feeling his way through the opening because he was spending like 3 minutes over queen b6, almost 4 minutes over queen c7. So Caruana's opening in that sense is justified. He's got Shankland out of his sort of normal routines. And now a4. Of course, black wants to gain counterplay with b5. And Caruana just shuts that down with a4. So he's playing in a more controlled way. He doesn't want this to spin into some position where it's, white just attacking on the king side, black attacking on the queen side. And b6 is the normal way to play in these kind of positions. You stop a5 and you put your bishop on the long diagonal opposite the queen. It looks very absolutely fine for black. And this is a very standard kind of setup. I like this a lot for black. Rook a e1. Well, that signals some aggressive intent, leaving the rook on f1, preparing to support the f-pawn, perhaps. Bishop e7. So white is very well developed, but as I said, I think black's setup is very good. By the way, bishop e7, that was Shankland's first big think. He spent 28.5 minutes over bishop e7. And this was Caruana's first big think. King h1, 23.5 minutes over king h1, a very restrained move. h5 from Shankland. Well, yeah, I mean, g4 might come at some point. It's hard to say. But h5 certainly prevents that. There was another interesting move for black here. Could play e5, which opens things up. Reasonable response, but obviously very sharp with black's king still in the middle. Anyway, king h1 played. Keeps lots of options open. h5 from Shankland. So that prevents g4, but also looks perhaps to play knight g4. That can be a very nice move. And you never know, the king could even go queenside. Bishop g5. Yeah, that's a nice move. So just using that g5 square now that the h-pawn is advanced. h4, well, white must not allow that pawn to come to h3, which would mean there's a lot lined up on that long diagonal. So h3, very important move. And now Shankland spent 20 minutes over rook h5. So you can see that with rook h5, it means that black is not going to be able to castle on the king side. So it's a very committal move, but it does, obviously it attacks the bishop, and Caruana just moved it back to f. Knight e5 hits the queen, which came back. And then the rook went all the way back to h8. So it's a strange position. Black cannot castle here. And queen d2. So Caruana just playing very gently at the moment. Just little steps. Knight d7. Supporting the knight. Maybe looking to swing round here. Bishop g5. Now that is a very nice move from Caruana and forces black to make a big decision here. So does black really want the bishops to be exchanged? Means, remember, black cannot castle kingside. I mean, don't want to anyway. So, king f8 might be necessary. But somehow without those bishops, a position like this feels quite nice for white. And you can see that the rooks are lined up perfectly to perhaps support the f-pawn's advance. There are no problems on the queen side. It feels very comfortable for white once those bishops are exchanged. Black's position lacks a bit of dynamism. So that's why Shankland chose f6, forcing the bishop back. But, I highlighted it a moment ago, that pawn on e6 is now vulnerable. This is such a key square in the Sicilian for black. If that pawn is undermined on e6, then the key outpost squares, d5 and f5, could be occupied by white. And that is a constant worry for black. If this pawn were to advance to f5, undermining that e6 pawn, then it could be possible for white to use the d5 square. So knight c4 played by Shankland. Okay, he wants to grab one of these bishops. That was exchanged off. Now, I'd like you to have a think about this position. White to play. How would you play with white? Caruana played his next 2 or 3 moves. In fact, his next 3 moves, let me see. Yeah, fairly quickly here. So, what's your plan with white? White play. Cheers. I'll have a drink. You have a think. White play. Now, did you go for f4 and f5? If you did, well, it's certainly not a bad idea. As I said, it feels right to undermine this pawn and gain some control over d5. The only thing is that bishop, after f4, that bishop lives. That bishop has something to do. It's working. Caruana played in a very different way. He played f3. Now, how many of you would be so restrained? So, Point number 1. Bolsters the e-pawn and shuts out that bishop on b7. That bishop on b7 is public enemy number 1. That is potentially a strong piece because there's no white square bishop to counter it. So positionally very desirable to shut it out of the game with f3. And the second point is that it makes room for the queen to come to f2. Now you remember a4 was played a long time ago to restrain black on the queen side, and you can see that the queen and bishop line up against that pawn on b6. And Shankland just went back with the queen to defend. Now again, f4 is possible, but no. Rook d1. So Caruana is playing in a completely different way. At first putting these rooks here, and in some positions it would be appropriate to advance the f-pawn, supported by the rook. But he's changed his strategy according to how Shankland has played. He's looking to shut out that bishop. This is all about restraint. And he's restraining black on the d-file as well. So these are black's two big breaks. And if he's preventing those, then he's really bottling black in. King f7 played. Remember, black can't castle. And rook d2. And actually it's very hard for black to find an active plan in this position. Bishop c6. So Shankland is looking to get in b5. The standard Sicilian move, but it's not clear it achieves that much. Knight d4, good move. That knight not active on b3, so it comes back into the game. Not only looks at the bishop, but looks at e6 as well. That's a slightly sensitive point. Knight e5, looking to get the knight in here, so b3. g5, okay, that secures the knight on e5. Not that Caruana was particularly looking to play that, but you never know. I mean, with the knight on d4, then f4, f5 certainly becomes more of a possibility. And it's possible for white to break like this. And then, well, recapture with either queen or bishop. And there's no doubt there is certain danger for black's king here. But black is at the moment solid enough. I mean, that's just another way of playing. But very interesting that Caruana has basically decided, nope, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to give black any play at all. That would open up the bishop. It would also open up the g-file. You know, there is counterplay there. But Caruana playing in a very different way. It's all about restraint. You could exchange off that bishop. But no. Knight e2. And the bishop came back, which does protect e6, but it's pretty passively placed. Once Caruana has locked out the bishop with these, you know, securing the pawn on e4, then he doesn't feel the need to exchange off that bishop. He's turning it into a bad piece. And c4. So you can see that Caruana's strategy is absolutely clear. He's now got this typical Maróczy bind with the pawns on c4 and e4, restraining black's pawn breaks. And this is starting to look quite serious for black. Knight d3, the knight comes back. You can see there are now 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces directed against the b5 square, restraining the pawn b5 push. Knight g6. Okay, so Shankland always has to be careful about, you know, is f4 a possibility? But you know, Caruana's not going for it. And now knight e2. So Caruana building up pressure on this pawn. You know, there could be circumstances when an exchange sack is even possible. But certainly with the knight on e2, then f4 looks to be more of a possibility, because then knight takes, after a big exchange, you can see that bishop would come to f4, and then there'd be a lot of firepower on the pawn on d6. So black needs a plan, and really the only pawn break for black here is b5. It's the only one possible. And if black doesn't do something, then yes, rook b8, for example, f4 is coming very quickly, and that's nasty. And then f4, f5. Okay, so b5, that gets exchanged. So there's potential for this pawn to become weak. So bishop b6 hits the rook, and then a5, securing the bishop here. Okay, it looks very nice. Again, it's about restraint. And, you know, if white is given a couple of more moves, there's potential to take here, but there's also perhaps b4. There's also this maneuver and knight d4 as well, and then capturing on b5. So Shankland basically decides, right, I've got to get rid of this bishop. I mean, it's really crippling black at the moment. So an exchange sack, and very understandable. Here Caruana has a choice. You could go into an endgame, which is quite possible, but interesting. He just keeps a bit more juice in the position. You know, he's playing for a win. Queen takes and knight d4. So Shankland has given up the exchange. He does have the two bishops here. Never underestimate the power of the two bishops. So Caruana has to be very careful here. b4. Attacking the knight, which goes to a4 and queen a7. I mean, exchange here isn't going to help black. It's quite possible that white will gang up on the b pawn. Later on, knight b5 will come. Looks really bad. So queen a7 and knight b2. So this knight's spinning around to one of these squares. Knight f4. Yeah, well, you can see that where the dark square bishop is gone, so this knight finds an active square. Knight d3. So, yeah, if possible, one would like to exchange this. Rook c8. Turns out this is a bad move. Would have been better to put the knight here and keep some activity. But still, I mean, it looks like white is better here. Rook c8. An exchange on f4. And again, a really interesting decision from Caruana. He decides just to put the queen back on e1. And he has very nice coordination and holds an advantage. He could have plunged in with queen takes f4. Of course, black has to play e5 and then takes the knight. The queen comes in. I mean, how many of us would be tempted by this? White has rook and two pawns against the two bishops. The king is really exposed. The queen is permanently active. I mean, there's no doubt that white is better here. But Caruana is not a gambler. He played queen e1. It's just a different way of playing. And with queen e1, it not only looks at that pawn on h4, but he also prepares to occupy the a file. So, for example, if rook h8, defending the pawn, rook a1. So the rook has the open file. And then queen d1, protecting the knight on d4 and preparing to double on the a file. Black is so passive there. I mean, that looks really, really good. So Shankland played e5, hitting the knight, which came into f5, of course. That's, you know, these are the key squares in the Sicilian. And now that knight is too menacing, so Shankland exchanged off. And played queen d7. And again, not risking queen takes. I mean, this is still very good for white, but queen e4, just maintaining control in the middle. And black has very little to do here. So this queen looks at the b pawn, it looks at these central squares. King g7. And again, queen b4 is possible. But this would at least give that bishop some scope. But no, rook d5. Just making sure that, you can see these pawns are blockaded. And that bishop is dead on e7. So it's all about restraint and control. King h6. I mean, there's not a lot that black can do at the moment. Queen takes b4. Okay, so finally Caruana plunges in, and an exchange of pawns. But now that's a very useful passed pawn, and the queen gets active, hitting the bishop. I mean, that is a terrible piece. Blocked in here. This pawn doesn't help. None of these pawns help. They're all on dart squares. That bishop is just not going to get into the game. b4. Why not? The rooks control the centre. And if black is doing nothing, let's just push this. Rook c3. Right. Potentially some counterplay. Taking here and taking here with maybe a perpetual. So queen a8 threatens the bishop. And rook c8 bounces back. Queen a7. Rook c3 again. Looking again to sack here. Queen f2. So making absolutely sure there are no sacks on f3. And black is just stuck here. King h5. I mean, the king, of course, defends the pawn. But now white pushes. The queen comes back, trying to find some counterplay here, but no. Queen b2. Behind the passed pawn. But also, look at this. Very nice move. Queen b1. Whoop. That queen is working so hard in this game. It's all, such fantastic power. No, really nice maneuvering from Caruana. So, when these are fixed, then the queen can have great fun. What a square. Looking down at h7 and f5, but also supporting that pawn. King h6. b6, of course, just keep pushing. And queen f5. Threatening f6, the king comes back, and rook a5. A decisive switch. So threatening rook a7, and a fatal attack on the king. Well, here Shankland resigned, because if bishop e7, then the rook comes in, threatening the bishop. If queen f7, then you can take on d6. You can see the white just crashes in. If bishop takes rook, you take, and as somebody said, loose pieces drop off. Check here, and queen d5. Fatal. And what a masterful performance from Fabiano Caruana. How many of us in such a position would just look to move the queen and shove that f-pawn up the board, or go for e5? But no, it's all about restraint. King h1. h3. Restraint. And coming back to this position. Here, again. It looks like white is set up to advance. But no, f3 and queen f2. And it's really telling that at the end of the game, these pawns are left in front of the king, making sure that the king is absolutely secure. And black was just picked apart here. It's a brilliant game. Absolutely brilliant. And, well, it just shows how powerful Fabiano Caruana is. In the end, he won with a winning margin of 1.5 points because, well, his rivals fell away in the final round. So at the end, Fabiano Caruana, 7 points out of 10. And then Sam Shankland had 5.5, Robson 5.5, Dominguez 5.5, Niemann 5.5, Aronian 5.5, or Wonder Liang 5.5. A big pile up there. Absolutely convincing victory at the end. And for that, Caruana receives $62,000, not bad. He also moves up to number 2 in the world. So Caruana's rating is now 28.05. Carlsen on 28.31, but not playing a lot of classical chess at the moment. Erigaisi getting very close. He's on 27.98, very close to the 2800 barrier. Of course, Nakamura on 28.02, but he's also not playing much classical chess. So Caruana on good form at the moment. We can definitely say that. So congratulations to him. I'm really pleased. It's that kind of persistence and, maintaining persistence and consistence that Caruana has at the moment. The past year he's been building up very nicely indeed. In the US Women's Championship, Carissa Yip won, even though she lost in rounds 9 and 10, and she drew in the final round just to make absolutely certain. And she won by a clear point. Pity she didn't make the 11 out of 11, but she came very close actually. There we go. More coming on the channel very soon. I should let you know that I'm going to be doing some more live broadcasts over the next month in the run-up to the World Championship match. I should say it's Ding's birthday today, on 24th of October. Many congratulations to him. More live broadcasts coming, and my Anti-Sicilians for Black book is being launched on the 6th of November, so look out for that. I'll be publicising that, of course, very soon. Thanks for watching.